Unexpected encounter. Lieutenant Nova Reed hated mornings on Helios 9. The chronometer chimed with artificial cheer, announcing, Day 74 of deployment. External temperature, -103 degrees Celsius. Have a productive day. Have a productive day, she mimicked in a sarcastic tone, pulling thermal layers over her regulation undergarments. Thanks for the enthusiasm, Wallace. She'd named the base's AI interface Wallace after her grandfather's ancient terrier, stubborn, predictable, and prone to making noise at inopportune moments. The comparison helped maintain her sanity in this frozen hellscape masquerading as a scientific outpost. The reinforced habitat pod barely qualified as living quarters, a hexagonal metal capsule buried beneath 3 meters of ice and snow, with interior space roughly equivalent to the crew cabin of a standard shuttle. Nova had sectioned it into rooms, using storage containers and hanging thermal sheets, sleeping area, workstation, and what generously could be called a kitchenette. Wallace, status report on overnight communications, she commanded, activating the heat on a protein packet. No incoming transmissions detected. Communication array operating at 62% efficiency. Recommend manual inspection and de-icing. Nova sighed. Another day, another trek across the frozen wasteland to knock ice off the comms array. Command had promised rotation after 60 days, but delays kept stretching her deployment. She'd learned to stop counting. Show me today's survey route, she said between bites of tasteless breakfast. The holographic display flickered to life, showing a glowing path through the crystalline formations of the western basin. Marking optimal route through Sector 17, B. Geological anomalies detected during orbital scan, flagged for investigation. Nova geared up methodically, 3 layers of thermal protection beneath the exosuit, helmet secured with double seals, equipment checked and rechecked. Helios 9 wasn't forgiving of mistakes. The planet's atmosphere contained enough oxygen to breathe, but delivered it with enough toxic particulates to scar lungs within minutes of exposure. The airlock cycled with a wheeze, releasing her onto the surface. Morning on Helios 9 wasn't bright. The distant sun barely penetrated the perpetual crystalline fog, casting everything in muted blue-gray light that made depth perception treacherous. Nova activated her pathfinder and began the trudge toward the western basin. The exosuit's servos whined with each step, fighting against the planet's slightly higher gravity and the treacherous terrain. Ice crystals formed on her visor faster than the heating elements could melt them away. Just another beautiful day in paradise, she muttered to herself. 3 hours into her survey, the sensor array on her wrist pinged. Nova paused, frowning at the readout. Organic material detected, non-native composition, temperature variance. Wallace, verify sensor function, she said, tapping the device. Equipment malfunctions weren't uncommon in these conditions. Sensors operating within normal parameters. Recommend investigation of anomaly. Nova adjusted her path, following the signal through a narrow passage between towering ice formations. The crystal structures here were different, sharp, angular, catching, and reflecting light in disorienting patterns. Her boots crunched through a thin crust of frozen gas that had precipitated overnight. She almost missed it, a dark shape partially buried in translucent ice, barely distinguishable from the shadows cast by the crystal formations. But as she drew closer, the shape resolved into unmistakably organic contours. Wallace, record all sensor data, Nova ordered, approaching cautiously. Full spectrum analysis. The figure was humanoid but definitely not human. Nova decided based on general morphology, was tall, with limbs slightly too long for human proportions. His skin had a metallic sheen, silver blue like polished steel with intricate patterns that might have been natural markings or some form of cultural decoration. What remained of his clothing appeared to be a flight suit of unfamiliar design, torn and damaged. Nova knelt beside the fallen figure. "Hey, can you hear me?" No response. She ran a medical scanner over the body. "Wallace, interpret these readings." Unknown physiology, limited comparative data, detecting electrical impulses consistent with neural activity, temperature significantly above ambient. Assessment, alive but compromised. Nova hesitated. Protocol was clear. Any encounter with non-terrestrial sentient life required immediate reporting and quarantine procedures. She should mark the location, return to base, and wait for a specialized containment team. But containment teams were weeks away, minimum. Nothing survived Helios 9's nights without protection. Wallace, estimate survival probability if subject remains at current location. Calculating environmental exposure against detected thermal regulation. Probability of survival, 8.7% with significant margin of error due to unknown biology. Nova made her decision. Activate emergency beacon on my location. Prepare medical station at base. She deployed the emergency transport sled from her pack, a flat, flexible sheet that stiffened when activated. With considerable effort, she managed to roll the alien onto it, noting that despite his size, he was surprisingly light, perhaps an adaptation to his home world's gravity. "Sorry about this," she muttered, securing straps across his body. "But dying alone in the ice is a lousy way to go, even for whatever you are." The return journey took twice as long, the sled's repulsors struggling against Helios 9's uneven terrain. By the time Nova reached the habitat, sweat had frozen inside her thermal layers despite the suit's regulation systems. Getting him inside was another challenge. The airlock wasn't designed for two, especially when one was unconscious. She managed it through a combination of awkward maneuvering and creative cursing. Inside, Nova placed him on her sleeping pallet, the only surface large enough to accommodate his frame. Under the habitat's lights, she could see his features clearly for the first time. His face was angular, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. No visible nose, just subtle ridges where a human's would be. His eyes, currently closed, seemed larger than human proportion under thin, silvery lids. "Wallace, run full decontamination sequence and extend medical analysis." Warning: quarantine protocols dictate immediate isolation of non-terrestrial biological entities. Violation noted. Override authorization, read Alpha 97. Log that I'm acting under Emergency Survival Directive 15. Override accepted. Decontamination sequence initiated. Note: Directive 15 requires continuous monitoring for contamination threats. Nova removed her exosuit, then turned her attention to her unexpected guest. His flight suit appeared to be integrated with some form of life support, but most systems were damaged. Medical sensors revealed multiple injuries, contusions, lacerations, and what appeared to be fractures in his unusual skeletal structure. "Any idea what species we're dealing with?" she asked Wallace. "Negative, no match in database. Recommend tissue sample for DNA analysis." Nova shook her head. "Let's try less invasive approaches first." She applied universal wound sealant to the visible injuries and set up the habitat's emergency warming unit beside the sleeping pallet. The medical scanner showed vital signs stabilizing, but without knowing his normal baselines, it was difficult to assess his condition accurately. Hours passed. Nova documented everything, prepared her report for transmission when the comms array cleared, and monitored her patient. She ate standing, unwilling to leave him unattended. As night fell outside, the habitat creaked and groaned as its exterior contracted in the extreme cold. Inside, the heating system labored audibly to maintain livable temperatures. "Wallace, divert non-essential power to heating and life support." "Compliance. Warning, weather alert. Category 3 ice storm approaching. Estimated arrival in 6 hours. Duration unknown. Nova leaned against the workstation, suddenly very tired. A storm meant communications would be completely blocked and the habitat would be tested to its structural limits. She glanced at her sleeping guest. Looks like we're going to be roommates for a while. As if in response to her words, the alien's eyes opened. Nova froze, then slowly raised her hands in a universal gesture of peace. Hello, you're safe. His eyes were remarkable, entirely silver with no visible iris or pupil, yet somehow expressive as they darted around the habitat, taking in every detail before fixing on her. He tried to sit up, then winced visibly. Easy, Nova said, approaching cautiously. You're injured, do you understand me? He stared at her, unblinking. Then his hand moved to his throat, making a strange gesture. Wallace, activate Universal Translation Protocols. Universal Translator active. No linguistic input detected. The alien made another attempt to rise, more successfully this time. Nova backed away slightly, giving him space while ensuring she could reach the stunner clipped to her belt if necessary. He studied her for a long moment, then very deliberately placed his hand over his chest and said in a voice like distant thunder, Thuron. Nova blinked in surprise. You speak English. He repeated the gesture, Thuron. Understanding dawned. Your name, you're Thuron. She mirrored his action, hand to her own chest. Nova. Nova, he repeated, the word sounding strange in his deep, resonant voice. A small victory, but communication had begun. Nova smiled cautiously. Welcome to Helios 9, Thuron. Probably not where you intended to be. Thuron looked around again, his gaze lingering on the habitat's viewscreen showing the bleak landscape outside. He said something in his own language, musical and complex. Cannot translate, Wallace announced unhelpfully. Nova gestured to her medical scanner, then to him. May I, to help? After a moment's hesitation, Thuron nodded once, a surprisingly human gesture. As she approached with the scanner, the habitat lights flickered ominously. Wallace's voice came through with static interference. Storm, approaching faster, then projected, recommend, emergency protocols. Nova cursed under her breath. Wallace, stability report. External, anchors compromised. In Sector 3, structural integrity at 87% and falling. The first blast hit like a physical blow, the entire habitat shifting several centimeters despite its ice anchors. Thuron's silver eyes widened, his posture instantly alert. It's okay, Nova said, not sure if he understood. Just a storm, we're safe inside. She hoped that was true. Another blast rocked the habitat, stronger this time. Warning lights flashed as the primary power fluctuated. Thuron rose to his full height, at least 30 centimeters taller than Nova, and moved with surprising steadiness toward the habitat's control panel. Before she could protest, his long fingers were moving across the interface, bypassing security protocols as if they were irrelevant. Hey, Nova started forward, then stopped as the habitat's system stabilized, power routing more efficiently than the standard protocols allowed. Thuron turned to her, saying something in his language, then seeming to realize she couldn't understand, pointed to the viewscreen, then made a sweeping motion with his hand. The storm, Nova nodded. Yes, it's dangerous. He pointed to the habitat's structural diagram, now displayed on the console, then to several key points where stress readings were highest. Nova understood immediately. You know how to reinforce it. As the storm intensified outside, they worked together in a strange but effective partnership, Nova gathering materials and tools based on Thuron's gestures and demonstrations, Thuron applying them with expertise that suggested he was some kind of engineer or technician. They reinforced junction points, rerouted power to critical systems, and established redundancies that Nova hadn't known were possible with the habitat's limited resources. When the worst of the storm hit, they were as prepared as possible. The habitat shuddered but held. In the dim emergency lighting, Thuron's silver eyes seemed to glow. "Thank you," Nova said simply. Thuron inclined his head, then suddenly staggered, his earlier injuries clearly taking their toll. Nova caught him before he could fall, surprised again by his lightness despite his size. "Rest now," she said, helping him back to the sleeping pallet. "We've got a long night ahead." As the storm howled outside like a living thing, Nova watched her alien guest slip back into unconsciousness and wondered what chain of events had brought him to this frozen world, and what it would mean for both their futures, thawing hearts. The storm raged for 3 days, transforming Helios 9's already hostile landscape into an apocalyptic nightmare. Winds powerful enough to strip flesh from bone hurled ice shards against the habitat's reinforced walls, creating a constant symphony of impacts that made sleep nearly impossible. Nova monitored the structural integrity readings obsessively, expecting each hour to be their last. Yet they survived, largely thanks to Thuron's mysterious technical expertise. By the morning of the 4th day, when the storm finally abated to merely horrific rather than catastrophic, Nova had established something like a routine with her alien guest. Though verbal communication remained limited, they developed an effective system of gestures, diagrams, and the occasional shared word. "Power stable," Nova announced, reading the latest diagnostics. "External temperature rising to merely fatal instead of instantly fatal. Progress." Thuron looked up from where he sat cross-legged on the floor, disassembling and repairing the habitat's backup filtration system. His silver eyes caught the light as he nodded, understanding her tone if not every word. "Nova," he said, gesturing to the communication array display, which showed complete failure. "I know," she sighed. "Command probably thinks I'm dead, not that they'd risk a recovery team in this weather anyway." Thuron stood, his movements still careful but stronger than when she'd found him. He approached the main console and pointed to a schematic of the external communication array. "Fix," he asked, one of the few Earth words he'd adopted. Nova shook her head. "Too dangerous. The array is on the ridge 2 kilometers away. We'd freeze before reaching it." Thuron considered this, then moved to the equipment locker. With deliberate motions, he began assembling survival gear, her spare exosuit components, thermal blankets, and tool kit. "Wait, you're not seriously suggesting," Nova began, then stopped as Thuron held up what looked like a small metallic disc extracted from his partially repaired flight suit. He tapped it, and it projected a holographic display of interlinked systems that Nova didn't recognize. "Help," he said simply. "You can boost the signal with that?" Nova asked, pointing to the communication array diagram, then making an amplification gesture. Thuron nodded once. Nova weighed their options. Without communications, they had no way to call for extraction or supplies. The habitat's resources were stretched to breaking point after the storm, oxygen recyclers operating at 60% efficiency, power reserves depleted, and food supplies calculated for 1 person, not 2. If another storm hit before they regained contact with command, survival probabilities dropped to single digits. "Okay," she decided. "We go together. If either of us shows signs of exposure, we turn back immediately." Preparing for the expedition took nearly 2 hours. Nova modified her spare exosuit components to fit Thuron's taller frame, layering thermal materials where the suit couldn't stretch. It wasn't perfect, but it would keep him alive, barely. Wallace, log expedition to restore communications. Estimated return 6 hours. Nova instructed as they prepared to exit through the airlock. Warning, expedition not recommended. Survival probability calculated at 47% under optimal conditions. Override. Maintain habitat at minimal life support to conserve power. Nova replied, securing her helmet. Outside, the landscape had been transformed. Where once there had been relatively smooth plains of ice, now massive crystal formations jutted at chaotic angles, creating a maze of reflecting surfaces and deadly sharp edges. The trek, difficult under normal circumstances, now became a treacherous navigation puzzle. They moved slowly, Thuron following Nova's lead through the safer passages. Despite his injuries and the ill-fitting protection, he moved with surprising grace, his lighter weight allowing him to cross fragile ice bridges that Nova had to detour around. 1 hour into their journey, Thuron suddenly grabbed Nova's arm, pulling her back just as a massive ice column collapsed where she would have been standing. She stared at the destruction, then at Thuron, who pointed to nearly invisible stress fractures in similar formations ahead. "You can see those?" she asked, knowing he wouldn't understand the words but hoping he'd grasp her meaning. Thuron tapped his helmet where a human's eyes would be, then made a gesture encompassing the ultraviolet and infrared spectrums. His vision, apparently, operated beyond human ranges. "Handy trick," Nova said, genuinely impressed. "Lead on." Thuron took point, guiding them through the crystal labyrinth with unerring precision. They reached the ridge in half the time Nova had estimated, despite the difficult terrain. The communication array stood on the highest point, a skeletal structure now barely recognizable beneath layers of ice. Nova activated her tool-kit's heating elements and began carefully melting away the incrustation from critical components. Thuron worked alongside her, his long fingers more dexterous even in the protective gloves. When they'd cleared enough of the apparatus, he connected his mysterious disc to the array's power coupling. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a pulse of energy surged through the system, melting remaining ice in an instant. The array hummed to life, lights blinking in sequence as it re-established connection with the orbital relay. Nova quickly input her access codes and sent the emergency beacon, followed by a compressed data packet containing her logs and Thuron's medical scans. "Signal confirmed," she said, relief washing through her as the console displayed the receipt acknowledgement. "Command will send extraction." She never finished the sentence. A secondary ice shelf, destabilized by the communication array's sudden heat output, gave way beneath them. Nova felt the sickening sensation of the ground disappearing, then Thuron's hand closing around her wrist with surprising strength as they both tumbled into darkness. When Nova regained consciousness, her first sensation was pain, a sharp, insistent throbbing in her left leg. Her second was warmth, unexpected and incongruous. She opened her eyes to near-total darkness, the only light coming from the emergency beacon on her suit, now cracked and flickering. "Thuron," she called, her voice sounding strange inside her damaged helmet. A soft glow appeared nearby, Thuron's eyes, reflecting her beacon's light. He moved closer, and she saw that they were in an ice cave, formed by the collapsed shelf. Her suit's environmental controls had failed, but remarkably, she wasn't freezing. Thuron had arranged emergency thermal blankets from their packs into a makeshift shelter, and something else was generating heat. The disk he'd used to repair the communication array, now repurposed as a heater. With careful movements, he removed her damaged helmet. "Hurt?" he asked, pointing to her leg. Nova nodded, gritting her teeth. "Broken, I think, can't walk." Thuron examined her leg without touching it, then reached into his pack and removed a small container of medical sealant from her supplies. With surprising gentleness, he applied it to her exposed skin where the suit had torn, preventing frostbite. "Thank you," Nova said, genuinely moved by his care. "The signal got through. They'll look for us." She pointed upward, then made circling motions to indicate search patterns. Thuron seemed to understand. He settled beside her, adding his body heat to their small haven. In the dim light, Nova studied his alien features, no longer strange to her. 3 days of shared survival had made the unfamiliar familiar. "Why were you here?" she asked, knowing he wouldn't understand but needing to fill the silence. "Your ship crash, you running from something." Thuron watched her face, then slowly reached out to touch his own chest. "Exile," he said in that resonant voice. Nova blinked in surprise. "You're an exile sent here as punishment." Thuron shook his head, then made a series of gestures. Shooting stars, then himself in a small vessel, then impact. "You crashed accident." He shook his head again, more emphatically. He mimed being pushed, then falling. "Someone forced you down. You were attacked." Thuron nodded once, his expression grim even on his alien features. Nova processed this. "You're running from something or someone." Before Thuron could respond, a low rumble vibrated through their ice prison. Dust and crystals showered down as the unstable formation shifted. Thuron immediately moved to shield Nova with his body as a larger section collapsed nearby. When the tremors subsided, their situation had worsened considerably. The cave entrance was now completely sealed, and thin cracks in the ceiling suggested further collapse was imminent. "Wallace," Nova activated her suit's communication system, hopping against hope. "Emergency beacon. Location, 2 kilometers northwest of habitat. Cave-in situation. 2 survivors trapped." Static answered her. "We need to find another way out," she said to Thuron, struggling to sit up despite the pain. "Scan for weaknesses, air circulation." Thuron seemed to understand. He moved methodically around their small prison, examining the walls and ceiling. After several minutes, he returned to Nova's side and pointed to a narrow fissure barely visible in the far wall. "Too small," Nova said, shaking her head. Thuron made an excavation gesture, then pointed to their tools. "Dig out, that could bring the whole place down on us." Another tremor, stronger than the first, emphasized her point. Thuron's expression changed, determination hardening his features. He gathered their remaining functional equipment, then returned to Nova. With careful movements, he lifted her despite her protests. "What are you doing?" Thuron carried her to the fissure, then set her down gently. He placed the disc device in her hands, closing her fingers around it firmly. Then he touched his chest. "Thuron," he touched hers. "Nova." Finally, he pointed to the fissure and made an unmistakable gesture. "Go." Understanding dawned. "No," Nova said firmly, "not without you." Thuron shook his head, then pointed to his own body, making a gesture indicating his slimmer build. Then he pointed to the fissure again, his meaning clear. It might accommodate her, but not him. "We find another way," Nova insisted. "Together." The cave trembled once more violently. A large section of ceiling crashed down mere meters away. Thuron's silver eyes held hers, conveying what words couldn't. Then, with surprising speed, he moved to the fissure and began widening it, his stronger arms making quick progress through the unstable ice. Within minutes, he had created an opening barely large enough for Nova to crawl through. Light, dim but unmistakable, filtered in from the other side. "Surface access," Nova realized, "but you've got to come too." Thuron shook his head again, then very deliberately took the disc from her hands and activated a sequence. It pulsed with bright energy, temporarily stabilizing the cave walls. "Temporary," he said, one of his few English words. "I'm not leaving you," Nova said, tears freezing on her cheeks in the sub-zero air. Another violent tremor decided for them. The cave began collapsing in earnest. With no choice left, Nova allowed Thuron to help her into the narrow passage. She crawled forward, agonizing progress with her injured leg until she emerged onto the surface. Behind her, she heard the sickening sound of complete structural failure. "Thuron!" she screamed, turning back toward the opening, now quickly disappearing as ice filled the passage. A hand thrust through, Thuron's distinctive long fingers, pushing something into the narrowing gap. Nova grabbed it, the disk device and something else, a small crystalline object marked with symbols she didn't recognize. Then the hand withdrew, and the passage sealed completely. Nova lay in the snow, clutching Thuron's devices, overwhelmed by loss and pain. The sound of engines broke through her grief. A search vessel, command responding to her beacon faster than she dared hope. Lieutenant Reed, voices called as figures in rescue gear approached. Vital signs detected. We've got a survivor. Two, Nova said as they reached her. There are 2 survivors. Get excavation equipment, now. Hours later, aboard the recovery vessel, Nova sat beside Thuron's medical pod, watching his vital signs with fierce concentration. The rescue team had worked miracles, cutting through the collapsed ice with precision equipment, following the faint energy signature of Thuron's mysterious technology. They'd found him barely alive, his alien physiology somehow sustaining him in conditions that would have killed a human instantly. The medical team had been reluctantly impressed, if completely baffled by his biology. The brass is having 17 different fits about this, Captain Mercer said, entering the medical bay and nodding toward Thuron's unconscious form. First contact protocols broken, unauthorized rescue operation, alien technology in your possession. They're deciding whether to court-martial you or give you a medal. He saved my life, Nova said simply, multiple times. Mercer's expression softened slightly. Yeah, that's in your report. Along with the data that this isn't just any alien, he's got tech we've never seen before. Intelligence is very interested. They're sending a specialized containment unit. Nova tensed. He's not a specimen for dissection. That's not my department, Lieutenant, Mercer said, though his uncomfortable expression suggested he shared her concerns. Orders are to stabilize him for transport to Central Research Facility on Ganymede. He'll be there in 3 days. After Mercer left, Nova sat in silence, studying the crystalline object Thuron had pushed through the collapsing passage. She'd kept it hidden from the recovery team, intuiting its importance. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to be coordinates, star charts perhaps. She looked at Thuron, still unconscious but stabilizing. In 3 days, he would become a research subject, potentially for the rest of his life. The same intelligence services that would value his technology would certainly be interested in his pursuers, perhaps even using him as bait. 3 days was enough time to make a different choice. Nova carefully placed her hand on the edge of Thuron's medical pod. We're not done yet, she promised quietly. This isn't how our story ends. As if in response, his silver eyes opened slightly, meeting hers. Understanding passed between them, transcending language and species. Nova nodded once decisively. Some boundaries, once crossed, changed everything. Some connections, once formed, couldn't be broken by protocol or duty or even the vast differences between worlds. In the cold emptiness of space, warmth could be found in the most unexpected places, and Nova Reed had no intention of letting it go.